Imagine waking up in a world without electricity, without screens, without modern medicine, and still being expected to survive, work, think, and plan for the future. Popular culture tells us that the Middle Ages were an age of ignorance, dirt, and blind obedience, that people didn't question authority, didn't care about comfort, and didn't understand the world around them. But most of what we believe about medieval life isn't history, it's storytelling. Today, we are going to look at the Middle Ages not as a dark backdrop for movies, but as a real human world, and at the myths that keep distorting it. When people think about the Middle Ages, they rarely imagine real lives. Instead, they picture a symbolic backdrop: mud, darkness, ignorance, and endless misery. This image feels familiar not because it is accurate, but because it is useful. A simplified past makes the present feel superior. If earlier centuries were foolish, dirty, and cruel, then modern society can see itself as the natural endpoint of progress. But history does not work that way. The Middle Ages were not a failure waiting to be corrected. They were a long period of adaptation to difficult conditions, shaped by practical choices rather than romantic ideals. Many popular beliefs about medieval life survive not because they are true, but because they are easy to remember, easy to film, and emotionally satisfying. Below are 12 of the most common misconceptions, not presented to mock the past, but to understand why these ideas appeared in the first place. Myth 1. Medieval people were indifferent to dirt and hygiene. The absence of modern plumbing is often mistaken for a lack of concern for cleanliness. In reality, people cared deeply about bodily comfort. They simply worked within limits. Water had to be carried, heated, or shared. Because of this, it was used carefully, not wastefully. Clothing was aired, bedding was shaken, floors were swept, and parasites were fought constantly. Cleanliness followed a practical logic rather than a modern aesthetic ideal. What looks like neglect from a distance was often an attempt to balance health, labor, and survival. Myth 2. Everyone lived in constant hunger. Medieval diets are often imagined as bleak and insufficient. Yet most people ate to sustain physical work, not to impress guests. Grains, legumes, vegetables, and bread formed the backbone of daily meals because they provided reliable energy. Meat appeared when animals could not be overwintered or when preservation was possible. In towns, buying prepared food often made more economic sense than cooking at home, since firewood was expensive and fires were dangerous. The idea of permanent starvation persists because scarcity fits modern expectations of a primitive past. Myth 3. Intelligence depended on modern technology. The lack of engines or electricity is often mistaken for the absence of thought. This confusion comes from measuring intelligence through outcomes rather than process. Medieval education emphasized logic, debate, memory, and classification. Scholars argued endlessly about philosophy, theology, mathematics, and nature. They recorded observations, compared sources, and refined earlier knowledge. What limited them was not curiosity, but tools. Without microscopes or modern instruments, certain discoveries were simply unreachable, not unthinkable. Myth 4. Medieval society was rigid and unchanging. Popular imagery freezes the Middle Ages into fixed roles. Men worked, women stayed inside, peasants obeyed, nobles rested. Reality was far more flexible. Most households functioned as economic units. Survival required cooperation, not ideology. Women managed property, ran businesses, supervised labor, and inherited trades. Children learned through participation, not formal schooling. Later centuries imposed stricter social models and projected them backward, rewriting the past to justify the present. Myth 5. violence dominated everyday life. Medieval society is often portrayed as endlessly brutal and chaotic, but violence was expensive. It disrupted agriculture, trade, and alliances. Communities developed systems to limit conflict because stability meant survival. Punishments were public and immediate, not out of cruelty, but because long-term imprisonment required resources most societies could not afford. This does not mean life was gentle, only that violence was managed, not constant. Myth 6. Medieval people feared all water. The idea that people avoided water entirely is an exaggeration. They feared certain conditions, not washing itself. Stagnant water, cold exposure, and sudden temperature changes were associated with illness. Flowing water, springs, and controlled bathing were widely used. Water was respected as a resource, not avoided as a threat. Modern interpretations confuse caution with superstition. Myth 7. The Middle Ages rejected learning and science. Education in the Middle Ages did not resemble modern universities, but it existed in structured forms. Logic, grammar, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine were taught and debated. Many institutions that later defined European education grew out of medieval systems. Knowledge was preserved, copied, and expanded within religious and civic centers. Conflicts between belief and inquiry existed, but they were not the defining feature of the era. Myth 8. Medieval people believed they lived in a dark age. No one living in the Middle Ages thought they were trapped between better eras. They believed they were improving on what came before. The label Middle Ages was applied later by thinkers who wanted to define themselves as a rebirth rather than a continuation. By placing earlier centuries in a shadow, they elevated their own time. This rhetorical framing flattened centuries of innovation into a single stereotype. Myth 9. Comfort did not matter. Comfort was not ignored, it was negotiated. Homes were designed to retain heat, block wind, and manage smoke. Clothing prioritized warmth and durability. Social customs evolved to reduce friction in crowded spaces. Comfort was not about luxury. It was about making life tolerable in an unpredictable environment. Myth 10. Medieval people lacked individuality. Modern media often portrays medieval society as faceless and uniform. In reality, identity was expressed through clothing, occupation, regional customs, and reputation. People cared deeply about status, appearance, and belonging. Color, texture, and craftsmanship carried meaning. Communities remembered individuals through stories, records, and reputation. Uniformity is a modern projection, not a historical reality. Myth 11. Progress replaced medieval thinking. Many ideas we associate with modernity did not appear suddenly. They evolved slowly through experimentation, failure, and adaptation. The Middle Ages were not erased by progress, they were absorbed into it. Later developments refined earlier solutions rather than rejecting them outright. Seeing history as a sequence of replacements hides continuity. Myth 12. We understand the Middle Ages better than they understood themselves. Perhaps the most persistent myth is our own confidence. Every era simplifies the past to make sense of itself. Medieval people misunderstood antiquity. We misunderstand the medieval world. Future generations will misunderstand us. History is not a mirror for pride. It is a conversation across time, shaped by incomplete information and changing values. Myth 13. Medieval people rarely traveled. The image of medieval life often suggests isolation. Villages frozen in place, people born and buried within a few kilometers. In reality, movement was constant. Traders, pilgrims, craftsmen, messengers, soldiers, and seasonal workers traveled far more than modern audiences expect. Markets depended on regional exchange. Religious life encouraged long-distance pilgrimages. Skills spread because people carried them. Travel was slower and riskier, but it was not unusual. A surprising number of people spent parts of their lives on the road. The myth survives because modern mobility feels unique, even when it isn't. Myth 14. Ordinary people had no sense of privacy. Crowded homes and shared spaces are often interpreted as proof that medieval people did not value privacy. What differed was not the desire for privacy, but the methods of achieving it. Privacy was created through timing, routine, and social agreement rather than architecture. Certain hours, spaces, and behaviors were understood as off-limits without needing walls or locks. Privacy existed as a social contract, not a physical barrier. Modern assumptions confuse material separation with personal boundaries. Myth 15. Medieval life was emotionally numb. Popular depictions often present medieval people as emotionally flat, either brutal or passive, but rarely reflective. Historical records show the opposite. Letters, songs, poems, legal complaints, and religious writings are filled with anxiety, affection, frustration, humor, and grief. People worried about reputation, family, loyalty, and loss. Emotional expression followed different conventions, but the emotional range was fully human. The myth persists because we mistake unfamiliar expression for emotional absence. Myth 16. Medieval people had no concept of time management. The absence of clocks is often interpreted as a lack of structure. Yet medieval life was deeply organized by time, just not by minutes and seconds. Days were divided by light, sound, and routine. Bells marked work, prayer, meals, and rest. Seasonal cycles dictated labor, travel, and celebration. Time was measured through rhythm rather than precision. The modern obsession with exact timing makes older systems appear chaotic, even when they were highly functional. Conclusion: why these myths survive? False images of the Middle Ages persist because they are convenient. They make modern life feel cleaner, smarter, and inevitable. But convenience is not accuracy. Understanding history requires resisting simple stories and accepting complexity. The Middle Ages were not waiting to be rescued by the future. They were lived, negotiated, and endured by people as thoughtful and limited as we are. And if we reduce them to caricatures, we lose not only their reality, but our ability to recognize our own.